Many of you have probably heard the rhyme that describes the fate of Henry VIII's wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But what happened to them after death? Where did these 6 unfortunate queens finally find their resting places? Which 2 queens became neighbours even in death? Which wife did Henry VIII choose to be buried beside? And whose remains endured a truly horrifying fate? In today's video, I'm going to tell you about 6 graves for the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Leave a like, and let's begin. On January 7th, 1536, at the age of 50, Catherine of Aragon died, the loyal and devoted first wife and queen of Henry VIII, rejected by him after nearly 24 years of marriage. During the autopsy, when her heart was examined, it was found to be completely black, despite the healthy appearance of all the other organs. Because of this, modern researchers believe that the cause of her death may have been cancer. But the Queen's close friend and imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis wrote in his letters that Catherine had been poisoned. Though, personally, I rather like the romantic and tragic thought that this woman died of a broken heart. After all, it is painfully symbolic that the illness struck precisely the organ that her former husband had trampled on again and again. The last 5 years of Catherine's life were truly humiliating, considering everything she had endured: the annulment of her marriage, her inability to see her daughter, and her exile from court. And sadly, Catherine's funeral proved to be just as humiliating as her final years. Despite the fact that Henry did allocate money for the funeral and outwardly everything appeared respectable enough, Catherine still did not receive the honour she deserved after death. She was buried not as the Queen of England, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales, the widow of Henry's brother Arthur, Prince of Wales. For her burial, Henry himself chose Peterborough Cathedral rather than Westminster Abbey, where his father, mother, and grandmother were buried. Nor did he choose Worcester Cathedral, where his brother lay, which, if you think about it, would have been far more logical if he had truly considered her his wife. But the more likely reason was that Henry did not want to draw too much attention to Catherine's death by transporting her body across the entire country and gathering crowds of mourners. And since Peterborough Abbey, as it was then, stood not far from Kimbolton Castle, where she had died, it became the chosen place. Henry himself did not attend the funeral and even forbade their daughter, the future Queen Mary I of England, from doing so, which to me feels like an astonishingly cruel act, denying a daughter the chance to say goodbye to her mother. Though Mary herself probably understood that these funerals were beneath both her dignity and her mother's. She even advised Chapuis not to attend, so as not to support the narrative of mourning a princess rather than a queen. And Henry truly turned the final farewell to his former wife into an act of propaganda. The Bishop of Rochester even declared during his sermon that at the hour of her death she confessed she was not Queen of England. But anyone who knows Catherine's story understands that she would never have said such a thing. Not even in her final moments. She believed far too strongly in her marriage and in her right to the crown. Still, Henry promised to erect a beautiful monument above Catherine's grave. And to his credit, he did keep that promise. However, the monument was later destroyed by the parliamentary forces of Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. And so, Catherine remained lying in a distant church beneath a modest and almost unnoticed black stone, but only until another queen corrected her fate. Nearly 4 centuries later, Mary of Teck visited Catherine's burial site and was shocked by how modest and unremarkable the resting place of a former Queen of England looked. She ordered royal symbols to be placed above the grave: 2 banners bearing the arms of England and Spain, and a golden inscription that reads, "Catherine, Queen of England." And so, justice was restored, by one woman for another. But it was not only a queen who remembered a queen. Ordinary women across the country, who also bore the name Catherine, donated money to restore the stone on her tomb. And in 1986, a wooden plaque was added, bearing the words, a queen greatly respected by the English people for her loyalty, piety, courage, and compassion. So, no matter how hard Henry tried, Catherine remained forever in people's memory as their queen. And even today, a festival in honour of Catherine of Aragon is held each year in the cathedral, where visitors bring pomegranates to her grave, the symbol of the Spain she loved so dearly. So, if you ever find yourself in that part of Britain, be sure to visit this faithful queen. And don't forget to bring a pomegranate. Anne Boleyn outlived her predecessor and rival by only 4 months and 12 days, falsely accused of treason and incest, largely at the hand of her own husband. She was executed on May 19th, 1536, in the Tower of London, where she would also find her final resting place. And this is a particularly bitter irony in Anne's story, because just 3 years earlier, it was in that very same tower that she had been preparing for her coronation as Queen of England. Yes, the tower was not always just a prison. Over the centuries, it served many purposes, from a royal treasury to an armoury and, even at one time, a zoo. And so, history played a cruel trick on Anne. In the very same chambers where she had once prepared to become queen, she later became a prisoner, waiting for her death, which came on a May morning. But if Henry VIII showed at least a small measure of respect toward the remains of Catherine of Aragon, the fate of Anne Boleyn's body was simply horrific. Yes, she did receive a strange sort of gift from her former husband. He granted her final wish, a skilled French executioner and death by sword rather than axe. But absolutely, no one had thought about something as basic as where her body would go afterward. No coffin had been prepared, and Anne's body simply lay on the scaffold while arrangements were hastily made for some sort of burial. Eventually, her ladies-in-waiting wrapped her body in white cloth and placed her remains into an old arrow chest that happened to be found in one of the tower's storerooms. Anne Boleyn, former Queen of England and mother of the future great Queen Elizabeth I, was buried without any honours after a short prayer in what was essentially a shared, unmarked grave inside the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, located within the Tower grounds. Only 2 days earlier, her brother George Boleyn had also found his final rest there. 5 years later, another of Henry VIII's wives, and Anne's own cousin, Catherine Howard, would also be buried in this same chapel. At the time of her execution, Catherine was likely between 16 and 19 years old, and like Anne, she too was accused of treason, though this time because of a real romantic relationship with Thomas Culpeper. And if Anne at least had something resembling a coffin, poor Catherine did not even receive that. She was buried directly in the earth, her body covered with quicklime, probably to speed up the decomposition, as if someone could not wait to erase from the world the girl who had once been called the Rose without a thorn. Over the years of Tudor rule, this ancient chapel would receive yet another historical figure familiar to us, Lady Jane Grey, executed on the orders of Mary I of England. And so, beneath a single stone altar in this small chapel, eventually lay 3 women who had once been Queens of England. Though, of course, Jane, like Catherine Howard, had never actually been crowned. Still, it seems to me a deeply dramatic companionship, and it remained that way for almost 3 centuries, largely forgotten, until during the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel had fallen into terrible condition, and it was decided to restore it in 1876. What the restorers discovered was far from pleasant. There were almost no intact coffins. The remains had been buried one above another, almost like layers in a cake. Using surviving records and descriptions from earlier centuries, the researchers began the search for the remains. The presumed body of Anne Boleyn was found beneath another coffin that had been buried there in 1740, that of Hannah Beresford. Her bones had simply been gathered together in a heap. Among those working on the project was surgeon Frederick J. Mowat, who conducted what we might today call a kind of forensic examination of the bones. He described them as belonging to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, slender and perfectly proportioned, with a small forehead and lower jaw, and vertebrae particularly small, especially the atlas, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck. The remains of Catherine Howard and Anne's brother, however, were never conclusively identified. 5 months later, Anne's bones were placed into a specially made lead coffin, along with the other identified remains, and reburied. Above them, beautiful inscribed markers were set into the chapel floor, bearing the names of the victims of the Tudor court. And in 2004, a memorial was erected at Tower Hill, the place where many of these executions had taken place. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard remain prisoners of the Tower forever, just as they once were prisoners of the love of their tyrant husband, Henry VIII. And if you ever find yourself in the Tower of London, step into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and bring these women a few roses. Flowers they both loved, just as much as they loved life itself. Among all of Henry VIII's wives, the only one who truly received a royal funeral according to proper court protocol was Jane Seymour. She died on October 24, 1537, of childbed fever, just 12 days after giving the king what he had wanted more than anything in the world, a son. After Jane's death, her body was laid out for mourning in the royal chapel of Hampton Court Palace, dressed in magnificent robes and adorned with royal ornaments. Later, her coffin was carried to St. George's Chapel, where she was buried on November 12, 1537. The chief mourner at the funeral was her stepdaughter Mary. Behind her walked a procession of 29 mourners, one for every year of Jane's life. Jane's marriage to the king lasted only about a year and a half, yet for Henry, it was probably the most meaningful of all his marriages. Even after her death, Henry continued to have himself portrayed beside Jane in portraits, and when his own time came, he wished to be buried with her. However, not all of Henry's plans came true. The king had commissioned a magnificent tomb for himself and his beloved wife, but by the time he died, it had not yet been completed. And later, none of his 3 heirs ever finished the project. Instead, parts of the monument were eventually used for other purposes. For example, the grand sarcophagus that had originally been intended for Henry was later used for the burial of Horatio Nelson. The last time this part of the chapel was open for the burial of other royal figures, it was noticed that Henry's coffin had been badly damaged. Historians believe this may have been caused by gases building up inside the body. Today, the burial place of Henry and Jane in St. George's Chapel is marked only by a simple black stone slab bearing their names and the names of those buried beside them. Perhaps there is a strange twist of fate in this. Henry himself never received the magnificent tomb he had envisioned, just as several of his wives were denied the dignity of a proper burial, and poor Jane simply shared his fate. Usually, in that famous rhyme, the word survived refers to Catherine Parr, but if we're being completely honest, the one who truly outlived them all was Anne of Cleves, a woman who not only managed to extract the maximum benefit from her short and unsuccessful marriage, but also went on to live a remarkably comfortable life, outliving Henry VIII, his son, and all of his other wives. Anne was, in truth, a woman of extraordinary diplomatic skill. As you probably know, during Henry's lifetime, Anne was granted the status of the king's beloved sister and received a very generous income. Thanks to her good relationships with his children, she continued to receive a substantial allowance during the reign of Edward VI. Later, when Mary I of England came to the throne, Anne even accompanied her at the coronation and was periodically invited to court. And do remember, Mary was a Catholic, while Anne was a Protestant. At a time when other Protestants were being burned at the stake, Anne had the wisdom to manage her relationship with her stepdaughter carefully enough to remain completely safe. When Anne died in 1557 at the age of 42, most likely also from cancer, her funeral was entirely paid for by Mary I and conducted with full dignity. Before the funeral, her coffin was covered with gold cloth and surrounded by candles that burned day and night. Anne is the only one of Henry's wives buried in Westminster Abbey. Her tomb is not especially grand, and if you don't know exactly where to look, you might easily walk past it without noticing. But even the story of her death and burial once again shows just how perceptive and intelligent she truly was. And perhaps Anne of Cleves lived a quieter story than the other wives of Henry VIII. But like every one of them, she deserves to be remembered. And finally, the last wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Parr. But the story connected to her remains is one that will truly make your hair stand on end. Just as this woman's life had been one long adventure, her fate after death turned into an adventure of its own. Catherine Parr died at the age of 35 or 36 from childbed fever. So although people often say that she survived Henry VIII, in truth she did not outlive him for very long, only about 1 year and 7 months. Still, during that year she managed to do quite a lot. She remarried, became pregnant, and gave birth. For a woman who had once been Queen of England, Catherine received extremely modest, almost unnoticed, funeral rites. She was buried immediately on the very day of her death, September 5th, in the chapel on the grounds of Sudeley Castle, deprived of almost everything that would normally have been expected for a woman of her rank. Even simple things like candles or a procession of mourners. And if we imagine that death brings a person peace, that certainly was not the case for Catherine. Soon after her burial, her husband Thomas Seymour was executed. The castle passed from hand to hand, was even used during military campaigns, and before long, both the castle and the chapel where the Queen lay fell into terrible ruin. Catherine's body was discovered almost by accident in 1782 by a local man named John Lucas, who stumbled upon her coffin buried about 2 feet underground. He opened the Queen's tomb and, driven by curiosity, cut a small slit in the wax cloth that wrapped her body. To his amazement, he found that Catherine's flesh was still white and moist, remarkably lifelike despite the fact that she had died more than 2 centuries earlier. He cut off several locks of Catherine's hair, removed a piece of fabric from her dress, and even pulled out one of the Queen's teeth, which today, along with other relics, can still be found in the Sudeley Museum. After satisfying his curiosity, Lucas left Catherine to rest in peace. But unfortunately, his discovery had terrible consequences for the long-dead Queen. News of the find spread quickly, attracting crowds of curious visitors to the tomb of Henry VIII's last wife. The coffin was opened 3 more times, purely out of curiosity, and this greatly accelerated the decomposition of the body. Soon, vandals broke into the tomb entirely, mutilated the remains, cut away pieces to sell as relics, and eventually even threw Catherine's bones out of the chapel. The poor Queen was finally reburied properly only in 1861, by which time her remains had already turned to dust and fragments. Since then, thankfully, she has not been disturbed again. Above the grave of this woman, who endured so much both in life and after death, a beautiful marble monument was erected depicting her with hands folded in prayer. It is perhaps the most elegant burial place among all of Henry VIII's wives. So, if you ever happen to travel near Sudeley Castle, be sure to visit Catherine. The castle still holds many artefacts connected to her, not only that infamous tooth, but also her books and her letters. And in the end, this woman deserves far more attention and space in history than she is often given. I always think of Catherine Parr as the maker of a queen, the woman who helped shape the future Queen, Elizabeth I. The lives and sometimes even the deaths of Henry VIII's wives were filled with drama and tragedy, much of it created by the one man they all shared as a husband. But in the end, justice found its way. Each of these women finally found peace. And most importantly, they are not forgotten. Their names and their stories are still discussed today, and their graves are visited with respect and warmth. And perhaps that is the truest form of immortality. And now tell me, which of the 6 queens' graves would you most like to visit to pay your respects? And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you've left a like. See you in the next one.